Welcome. Good evening to those of you dialing in from North America. My name is Frederick Narbig. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. We have an incredibly exciting session for you today. This is our webinar number 7 in our series for our 2024 Accelerator cohort. And today's topic is attracting talent and building effective MedTech advisory boards. We have a terrific panel here today, and I'll get them to introduce themselves in just a moment. Let me just introduce the MedTech Innovator team first. So here joining me out of our Singapore office is Glenn Lim, head of programs, and Nerissa, program manager, and Bernice, who heads marketing and events. So we have, I'm delighted to introduce to you, we have two experts in this area. We have Dr. Anand Sivaraman, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Remedio Innovative Solutions based out of Mumbai. So Anand and Remedio were part of our 2020 MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific cohort. So that was in the middle of COVID. And he's done some tremendous things with his organization that he'll talk about in terms of scaling it, in terms of building a strong presence in the US and outside of India, which we'll share with us. I'm also delighted to introduce to you AJ Nair, who is president at the Mullings Group, Asia Pacific, based out of Perth, Australia. And I'll ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Maybe let me turn to AJ first. Tell us a bit about yourself, your organization, and maybe share with us some examples of the sort of work that you typically do with MedTech clients, large or small.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. Big thank you to the MedTech Innovator team for such an amazing event and the opportunity to be on this this webinar. So the Mullings Group we've been in the business for about 32 years. We are a executive recruitment advisory firm based out of the US with our headquarters in Florida, but we do have global locations around the world. We specifically focus on med tech, med device, health tech, and really building teams is our forte. We span functions all across sales, clinical, you name it. I mean, all the way from technical. And we go and really pride ourselves in build outs. Oftentimes, companies approach us from one side of the globe to the other, asking for full team build outs. And then we also build C-suite boards and really executive all the way down to commercial level roles. And I run the Eurasia desk. So I've got a small region, Europe, Asia, inclusive of Australia, and a tiny bit of presence in the Middle East as well. And just a quick note, my background prior to the Mullings Group, I come from about 22 years of medical device experience, predominantly in the commercial space. So that's our background.
Perfect. Thank you so much, AJ. Anand, great to see you again after a few years, and when you were part of our 2020 cohort. Please tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us about Remedio. I know you're currently one of the leading ophthalmology players in India, and have had a tremendous growth journey. So tell us a little bit about that. And you currently have an organization of, I believe, in the order of about 170 people globally, how you got to that point. And then we'll get into the details of some of the challenges and the strategies that you may have pursued along the way.
Thanks so much, Frederick. Lovely being here. And in a way, it's homecoming, having been part of the 2020 cohort. Thanks to the MTI team for having me over. So Remedio, the business that I lead, is an organization that's built around the purpose of bringing what we call specialist care to primary care. So we've, as you rightly pointed out, established this or in the process of being able to scale this in the ophthalmology space. So the question we ask ourselves is, how do we make healthcare access simple by bringing in technologies that allow for care to be brought to closer to the patient? So what it means in the developing world like India is bringing it to the last mile, and what it means in terms of the US is to bring it to homes. So this is a lot of what we do. From the perspective of how we do it, it's using AI as well as connected technologies, in this case, imaging technologies that we have patents around. So yes, the growth from where we were to where we are today has been as a result of, I think, 2 to 3 key things. One is being able to identify the right market segment to work on in both of these markets. Today, of course, we're based out of India, Singapore, and the US. In India, we primarily do a lot of the hardware device development and manufacturing, and we have an AI team that's based out of Singapore, where we build what's called offline or privacy preserving AI on the edge. And we have a commercial team that's based out of the US in order to be able to bring our products to market there as well. It's been quite a journey and quite a learning. Happy to share that. And what we typically do as an organization is to be able to ask ourselves, how do we build an ecosystem? Because I believe that at the end of the day, it's the impact that we all have as companies or as groups is really about how we help each other and have the impact that we do. And that's served us well. And that's one aspect that I'm hoping to also get into, because it's always been about mentors and, more importantly, ecosystem builders that have helped us as well to get to where we are.
Great. Thank you for that, Anand. We'll look forward to diving into some of those topics in a bit more detail. So let's begin, and we'll talk about maybe talent acquisition or recruitment more generally first. And AJ, let me turn to you. A quick question, but it's not, the answer maybe is not so basic, that we very often get from our cohort companies is, we're early stage, it's early days, we don't have a lot of cash. What can we do to attract top talent to our organization? What advice do you typically give to companies at that stage of development?
Yeah, one of the things I really like about that question, Frederick, is the fact that we're saying attract as opposed to hire, right? The advice that myself and really colleagues in the firm give to a lot of companies in this stage is really, if you want to be attracting top talent, you want to be a company, a story, a vision, a mission that is attractive. And so we fundamentally start with having the C-suite, the founding team, really talk about your mission, really espouse what you're about, what's the market like, what's the vision that you have, what's the solution that you're coming up with, and really what the leadership construct is. And we often advise young companies, be confident talking about your company in the social space, right? Really talk about the essence of your company, because we always say in the recruitment business, top talent isn't looking for jobs. Top talent is actually working on passionate gigs. They've got their head down. They're working on things that they love doing. Oftentimes, they need to be inspired, or they're tapped by somebody in their network to say, "Hey, you should check out this company. You should check out the CEO." So fundamentally, I would say, the C-suite of a emerging young company should really be focusing on espousing that story, creating a company that's really attractive, passionate, and then working through, maybe pause at this last point. Don't wait to hire top talent only when you have funding. Begin that process when you have the need. Start with org structures early on. There's nothing wrong with evolving org structures over and over and over. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's the whole concept of scale. But when you start identifying key roles, start networking and identifying who those people or those networks might be. And really, I'll pause at the fact that don't wait for funding to be the trigger for you to start looking for talent.
Appreciate that, AJ. That's a great point. I guess some companies might push back though and say, well, look, if I don't have the funds, how can I recruit these people? Which kind of brings us to the topic of how to incentivize early hires. And maybe let me turn to Anand here first. When in the early stages of Remedyo, what did you do to try to attract top talent to your organization, and what are some of the ways that you have been incentivizing your teams, and has that the way of incentivizing those teams, has that evolved over time as the organization has evolved? You're on mute, Anand.
Absolutely, Frederick. Maybe I'll build on some of what Ajay was also talking about. I think in the very early stages, the kind of incentives that we built around was all around the story and the purpose of the organization, right? Because I feel sometimes as founders, there is the part around the vision and the mission, and that usually is very big and ambitious. as you start off, but I've often found that purpose of why you do what you do is as important and actually does a great job in attracting talent as well. Coming to the point on the incentives, it's evolved as we have grown as an organization, but in the early days, the incentives would be things that are on the soft side to something that's also very physically relevant as well. And what I mean by that is some of the early talents were about us being able to provide the freedom to do things that they did not have or see as an opportunity elsewhere, right? And that's something which held us well in the early stages, because as a company building optical technologies, instrumentation, etc., India does not necessarily have a very vast pool of talent, at least in the early days when we got started off in these highly niche areas. And so it was almost a needle in a haystack. So the incentives, therefore, was about the freedom and about being able to do something. I mean, you sell a larger purpose. So for me personally, it was about selling the idea of how do you build India as a product nation. And that's something that was the incense to evolving to a point where today we also have incentives that are the standard around ESOPs that you would think of. But one of the things that we've started doing, and it's actually served us very well, is we think in terms of incentives for sales, for example, in terms of bonuses and payouts, but we also have that today for the research and development team. We have that also for branding marketing. So what we've done is to basically structure the CTC in a manner where it has three components to it. There is, of course, what you have the fixed, but the incentives, actually, we make sure that it's available across the organization, and it's sort of linked to the KPIs that you have, but more importantly, is not looked at as only those that are provided to the sales team, but is also provided to the research and development as well as the other teams, the non-customer facing teams as well. Those are the additional incentives that we would look at, which are, I think, something that we learned along the way as equally important. And last point I would add is things like ESOPs are extremely useful. However, they are very contextual as well, right? I always believe that talent has to be viewed in context. So there are going to be cases where we found it difficult to think of just ESOPs alone, because not everyone would in the organization would look at the incentives around ESOP. So we therefore had to bring in these other aspects as well that we talked about as incentives. But those would be the set that I would look at. But I would end with the first one. The purpose in the early days is a great storyteller and is a great attractor.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And that's exactly AJ's point, I think, as well. ESOP, for those of you who are not aware, is employee stock option program, I think typically is what that means. AJ, let me come back to you and maybe, to be fair, let you respond to the point that I made, that it can be difficult for a startup to hire before they raise the money. And what do you typically advise those types of companies? How can they bring people on board when they may not necessarily have the funds? And what are maybe some of the creative ways of incentivizing talent that you've seen, especially for early stage companies?
Yeah, I think founders and young companies need to keep in mind that there are a lot of individuals who are probably at the 15 to 20 year mark in their careers, and perhaps even 20 plus, that are getting to a stage which, Bill George, the author of True North, ex-Medtronic CEO, he often refers to as the give back phase, where at the 25 year mark of executives, often individuals want to use Anand's word, impact. They really, really want to make an impact. And often people who come from large corporations towards the tail end of their career feel like they've run large P&Ls, they've run large regions, but are they individually really making an imprint at that point? So often you'll find individuals who are looking to make that impact, and now they want to move towards the younger cohort, the startups, the mid-tiers. So look, number one, I would say networking to find individuals that are passionate about similar culture. But other than that, I work with a lot of young emerging companies that are probably at right around 6 months before a funding milestone is where I often tell people to start identifying talent. Because it's going to take you, if you're going to add a C-suite individual, you really should give yourself on both ends of the spectrum 3 to 6 months to allow for that process, right? You've got to find the right individuals, You've got to have the right cultural fit. So you need to have them really, experience both sides of the team. And then that individual is also going to have to leave their role, which means notice periods, all of that stuff. So
Absolutely.
I often tell companies, think through 6 months pre-funding milestone is really where you need to think through this. And if you're looking at companies around the A to B plus series, oftentimes they're telling investors what their commercial growth strategies are. And you cannot have those strategies without commercial leaders as part of your organization. So we often see investors going, I was recently working with a client who's at a Series B, and the investors are like, you're talking about scaling, but you don't have a chief commercial officer or a VP of sales. How are you going to achieve that? And so they came back to us going, oh, AJ, we're going to need a VP of sales.
Right.
So that's the advice I give is sort of identify the culture fit and then really plan kind of that 6 month reverse engineering to start intaking individuals.
That's a great point, because very often we see startups where the founder may be a clinician or an engineer, and they might delay the hiring of that commercial business person. But what you're saying is do that 6 months before a major fundraise. But at what point in time, AJ, would you recommend a company look to make commercial recruitments in relation to when they're likely to be on the market? Is it something that you would recommend they do a year before approval, even earlier, perhaps during the development phase of the company? What have you seen, and what would be some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, look, I've seen companies hire very early, perhaps a year and a half before a milestone regulatory approval. I've had Australian clients who are going for FDA and then potentially reimbursement in the US, and they hired commercial teams about a year and a half prior. To me, that's way too early. And you also need to know the nuances of culture. American commercial individuals are, give me the product and I want to go tomorrow, right? And if you hire somebody at 150, 250 package and you don't have a product to give them for a year, they're not going to stick around for very long. So I would say really having line of sight of about 6 months to a year, depending on the levels that you're looking for. If you're looking for a senior individual, I'd go on the longer end. If you're looking for, building sales reps across the country, a 6 to 8 month window is pretty good, depending on the number of people you want to hire. But keep in mind that when you bring these people, you need to have a window of things that you want them to do. Right. And commercial individuals, I'm one of them, are the most ADHD, OCD individuals, right? Like we need things to do, and we are incentive driven. I know Anand knows this very well. So you need to balance that ratio of finding the right people with what you actually want them to do in the market.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. Anand, maybe share a little bit with us about some of your commercial hires and at what point in time did you decide to bring them on board, and why, whether they're based in India or whether they're based in the US or elsewhere?
I think I tend to agree with AJ that it's important to bring in the commercial folks at the point when you're ready for the market. But the other side to it is when you know when you're ready, right? And I'm a firm believer in the fact that if you look at the commercial side and not look at it as sales alone, but you look at it all the way from product management to business development and then sales, if you look at it from a narrative that's staged that way, oftentimes it's good to sort of have the early product managers who also, in a way, are folks who would do the early adopter sales, as we like to call it, which ensures the product market fit. And once, let's say, you have the product market fit in place, is the right point when I think you would bring in someone who's able to scale that early narrative of a product market fit from early adopters to something that is actually a framework-driven sales, if you would actually look at that. And that's been a learning, whether in India or the US. Of course, as is always the case, the first few sales and the first few narratives have to be along with the purpose rather than the product by itself. So someone in the founding team has to be there with them. It's not something that I feel you can sort of give it to someone else in the early stages. You've got to be part of it. And it's very, very useful because it gives you a strong feedback in terms of where you are.
Mm.
The difference between, let's say, what we did in India versus what we did in the US is obviously it's very important. And this is something that I learned, where you need to know what you can and what you don't know to do, right? And that's something which is very, very important very early. So figuring out and the strategy that you have to know whether you have a product market fit and whether you know whether what you have is going to sell is very geography dependent. And there are cultural factors, and there are also larger ecosystem factors at play. For example, India is an out-of-pocket expense related market, and in the US, it's a peer-driven market. So it's therefore very important I therefore believe that, I know we were talking about raising it, 3 to 6 months before the fundraise extra, but I look at it differently. You never stop hiring, and you always want to be on the lookout for the talent, because it's always good to bring them in early, especially if they're aligned with the larger mission of the organization. And I typically also look for those who are in the early stages, who are ready to wear multiple hats on the commercial side, going from product to business to sales organization or CCO-led sales. So that's how we've tried doing it. And our learnings in the US have been very different from our learnings in India.
That's very interesting, Anil. Some great tips and advice there. And if you were to reflect maybe on some of your best hires over the year, what would you say are some of the key best practices, and what made that particular recruitment process so successful?
I think it's first about conversations. And so if I were to look at it when I was reflecting on this and I look at it from a framework perspective, I think it's about giving the best hires have been those where the conversations have been there at least for more than a month or two, and that relationship was built first, right? And
Right.
I'm a firm believer in that. So I would say building that relationship out in being able to understand as much as you would want them to know about why they should join you and what is it that you seek to be able to do as a result of that hire. It's as much a two-way street. You need to be able to also ask, where are you adding value to the other side, right? And that is something that I realize oftentimes that in the early stages, and even now it's a work in progress, but it is something that's equally important. You need to spend as much time on it. So some of the best hires have been where you spend the time finding out what this means for them, and how what they do in the organization is going to contribute to their growth and what they wish to do next. The second key part on some of the best hires have been where there is a certain complementarity. So oftentimes you look for a certain amount of diversity, and by diversity I mean, and this is sort of a balance you need to draw. Sometimes I know that we always look for those that fit to a culture, but I tend to think slightly differently, where I feel that some of the best hires have been those who complement and sometimes can also take stands that question or debate, which allows very early for you to be able to bring in that culture of course correction as a result of having perspectives that come in that may be very different from the way you may be thinking upfront. So some of the good hires have been those, therefore, who are very open in their perspectives and who are able to have those conversations which are on the strategic as well as on the operational. So that's second. The third, I think, is passion, right? I always believe in that a lot. It's personality, passion, and do they share the same energy as you do? And that is something that in all of our best hires, their ability to bring that passion out of being able to convert that passion into outcomes is something that I've seen as common in all of our really great hires. And lastly, I think it's about people who value freedom, and I believe in this a lot. If a culture allows the freedom to implement and figure out, and at the same time they bring in the aspect of I may not know this, but I'll figure it out. Some of our best hires have been those who come in with that, especially in the early stages, right? Before you move into much more structured, framework-driven initiatives within the organization. Those have been the ones. And of course, always some of the best hires for us have been those who end up doing for the very first time something that they've never done before. So I think that's one of the great lessons I've had as well in if I look at the pattern among those with high passion as well as the ability to do extremely well within an organization, at least in Remedio.
Thanks for that, Anand. Some really, really great advice there. Appreciate your insights. And let me turn to AJ here for a moment. And first of all, maybe you want to comment on some of the things that that Anand referred to here, because I thought he raised a number of good points, and you must have seen this across multiple organizations, AJ, where and if you were to make the same sort of reflection where you made a particularly good hire for maybe a smaller company. What made that hire particularly successful, and what are some of the other problems and challenges perhaps that you need to overcome in that process?
Yeah, I was smiling when Anand was talking, because I think he was pretty much forming a mic drop answer. And I can see, Anand, why you've done so well. Kudos. But yeah, I mean, I really would echo things that Anand has said. These are some of the best practices I have seen, to start with, and to summarize, not to replicate, but CEOs or founding C-level individuals who are absolutely engaged, giving both sides of the coin enough time to find that fit, right? The people who really take the time to get to know individuals, talk to them, work through why they're interested in this role, what's in it for them, really identifying the culture, the passion. But I also love what Anand said about their freedom to governance, right? Like, you want these individuals to come in, but you really want them to be free to create, produce, solve problems. Because especially in emerging, micromanagement just doesn't work at all. And so when you're hiring people, you want them to be the future leaders of the company. And often we talk about a concept called the lightning rod concept, where you want to hire people that are going to attract more amazing people, right? So oftentimes what I've seen good CEOs do is they hire individuals once they've completely vetted out the passion, the culture, and what that person is going to bring to the company. What I've also seen is they become multipliers. Those individuals attract even more amazing people, right? So yeah, I just wanted to echo what Anand said. I mean, I think it's a fantastic answer.
Great, thank you for that, AJ. So, Anand, a couple of quick questions for you. Do you typically personally get involved in major recruitment within Remedio? Do you work with an external search firm, and if you do, did you start working with an external search firm very early on in the process, or was that something that you brought in a little bit later on? And do your investors typically get involved in the recruitment process? Because I know that happens from time to time.
Okay, I think let's take the first one there in terms of do I get involved? Very early, yes, it was very, very important. And I feel that while people think products, I think people define companies, especially in the MedTech space, because we are in it for a marathon, right? And we are not in it for a sprint. So at the end of the day, therefore, it becomes very important to have the right set of people who share your passion. And therefore, yes, in the early days, I was very, very involved. Even today, I'm very involved in some of the key hires that we do, especially as we look at being able to experiment on new ways for scaling, for example, will involve me participating in that process. But at the end of the day, I think, and I mean this well, I don't think you can, and this is my perspective, it's very difficult to sort of completely outsource. You may be able to outsource the aspect of being able to identify the leads and then those that you talk to, but it's going to be very difficult for organizations. At least I believe that it's very important to have a strong recruitment team internally as well, so that you're able to define, for example, at Remedio, we've defined certain personality attributes, right? because we're able to, over time, identify what are the key attributes that you look for in a person that does extremely well at Remedio, right? And we were able to codify that, which then allows a common frame of reference for everyone that's speaking to new candidates, right? And that sort of starts the setting up of the culture, if you will. But at the same time, we do use external agencies, but we believe a lot that you need to have strong talent acquisition team internally within the company as well, even as you may work with external agencies, because I believe that especially in medical devices as well as in health tech in general as a field, being you always are going to be looking for talent that are going to be difficult to come by. And one of the things that we have now started doing is how do you actually start creating pipeline and start creating those that you are seeking to be able to bring in much before the need arises, right? And that's where I think having some of the talent acquisition team internally within the organization, I think is extremely important, even as you think about things like succession planning and others that normally you talk about. But those are usually things that people relate to large established organizations. But I look at it differently, which is you think of being able to hire talent early to build in more of that complementarity. And it's usually very difficult to talk about the DNA of the organization and get it 100% right if you outsource the full process of talent acquisition. So that's the reason why I'm a firm believer in having a strong talent acquisition team internally, who, by the way, would, as part of their operational strategy, also engage with external agencies. And that's sort of served us well so far, even as we continue to improve in terms of how we do that.
And that's really helpful. And your investors and board members, do they typically get involved from time to time, or?
So, yeah, I mean, it depends on, for example, I believe that it strongly depends on the position for which you're trying to hire. It's oftentimes you will get very good contacts from the network that the investors bring in, right? And that's where I think it's very important to sort of look at fairly long-term investors early who sort of want to build this out with you as much as they may be giving the investment. So some of the things that I know that we often talk about is what else other than the money that the investor puts in. And we always say, is there a way by which they can help in sales, etc.?
Right.
But I feel the stronger thing is if they can help in people. Because I think if the people are good, sales will happen. If the people, product, and process are good, sales will happen.
Right.
So the people part is something that I think some of the very good boards are able to do a much better job there. For us personally, I guess some levels to some extent, but a lot of it was as a result of the internal talent acquisition team that we were building in. And second, as you go and you keep meeting people and starting to see fits or things that you may be able to offer as opportunities for others. And that's sort of been the success mantra for us.
Right. That's helpful. AJ, how early does your firm typically engage with smaller companies, and do you sometimes work with the investors or the board members as well of those organizations in the early days?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, I would say majority of our work tends to happen in the Series A, B, and later stages, because that's really where bigger build outs seem to happen, and more trans geographic build outs tend to happen, which is where we really come as our expertise because of our network. But even at the seed and Series A levels, we'll get involved by founders or core investors, board members, where they're looking for the right C level individual. So we get involved. I'd say probably 20 to 30% on the earlier end, and much bigger build outs on the Series A and later.
Right. Makes sense. I want to talk a bit about advisory boards, and more specifically scientific advisory board. And AJ, let me stay with you here for a second. At what point in your experience do you see a MedTech startup? At what point should they start to build that advisory board, especially of KOLs and scientific advisors, and any tips that you can give perhaps on engaging with KOLs in the early days, especially when companies typically don't have a whole lot of money.
Yeah, on the tip side, maybe let me start there. I would advise startups and emerging medtech not to look at scientific advisory members purely for symbolism, right? I mean, that's something that I've seen perhaps far too often that I'd like to see, where young startups will, host an array of advisors that are, very well known in the field, but the fundamental question, I've been a sales rep myself. The fundamental question I would ask a scientific advisor is, would you use this product that you sit on the board for? And if their answer is no, I mean, that's a house of cards right there. Why are you sitting on the advisory board if you're not a believer in the product, right? So I think my number one advice to young companies is you don't need to go advisory crazy in the early days. Try to find the right individuals who believe in the theory, the science. Perhaps they've come from the same research themselves. Don't just choose a practice, choose their philosophy, their field, their research, and then really start building that as you become closer and closer to validation, first in human, building out clinical trials, because that's really where the strength of the scientific advisory board comes into, is when you're now starting to prove in human trials the extent of the concept. And that's where I see a lot of companies looking at it as scientific advisory team going, okay, they're doing clinical studies, let's say, for example, in the US, and here are the members that are either involved in the trials or, perhaps or sitting on the advisory board. That's when validation really starts to stick. So I hope that makes sense, but I would say in the early days, do not create an advisory board for pomp. Really be methodical about the purpose there.
I think that's great advice, and I think we often make that same observation. Very senior KOLs may be on a board, but they end up being grossly underutilized. They don't have an opportunity to contribute and don't stay very long on the board. Anand, what's been your journey building out your scientific advisory board, and what would be some of your thoughts and tips and advice perhaps on earlier stage companies?
So I fully agree with AJ there. I think he raised a very important point on this, on not doing something for symbolism. And I think that's extremely good advice. And to add to that, right, one of the things that I look at is not from a scientific advisory board. I sort of ask myself, who can the chief evangelists be, right? You need the evangelists early to sort of talk about it. And he's absolutely right that the best evangelists are those who actually have had an impact or see a need and felt impact as a result of using your product or service. So I really think that what we did was also that, which is we did not necessarily have them, and lo and behold, many of the evangelists don't even need to be called a scientific advisory board member. They are more happy to do it because they've experienced what can be done with the product. And it's very easy for them to be part of it. That's point number one. I fully agree with AJ on that particular part. The second is the right time in terms of getting the evangelists, I feel, is there is going to be the different markets are slightly different. In a little more of a framework-driven market where the role of key opinion leaders, as well as those that are your early cheerleaders, if you will, versus, let's say, what we did was we today, especially many of them tend to be on the clinical side, right? And what we decided to do very early was to actually have a chief medical officer join the company full time, right? And then we built around that. And I, for one, felt that was very, very important because for us, our sales in the US has been primarily as a result of technical marketing, as a result of the 50 plus publications that we have. And I believe that that's really where the intersection of evangelism, scientific advisory board, and chief medical officer sort of comes together in a way, because they're the ones that are able to create that momentum. And that happens when you are able to essentially create those clinical studies, etc., but done in a manner where it builds the aura around the product or service. And so we've therefore looked at the scientific advisory board very, very differently, right? We've not looked at it from a transactional perspective, but we've been looking at it more from an evangelism perspective. And I think there's a difference between the two. When you look at it from an evangelist perspective, they want to be part of it because they have actually seen the impact, and they really want others to also follow. They want to be these cheerleaders. That's the only additional point that I wanted to raise. In addition to adding to what AJ said, yes, never do it for symbolism, because it gets seen through.
Yeah. No, great advice there. And I guess when you're talking to an evangelist or an ambassador for your company, then maybe the financial incentives matter a lot less, because that's not what drives them primarily. But I did want to touch on how scientific advisory board members typically should be incentivized. And AJ, from your experience, what are some of the arrangements that you've come across? What do typically KOLs sitting on a scientific advisory board, what do they expect from companies in terms of compensation?
Yeah, I think look, I'll be sort of binary about this. I mean, obviously, based on the degree of evangelism on the lower end, I assume, and I've worked with individuals where they just look for cash and equity. And that those scales sort of, that's why tongue in cheek, I talk about degree of evangelism, because I've seen surgeons, physicians, KOLs who'll just say, look, I've got a great position. I've got a choice of various board roles. I'm happy to do this if you give me $250,000 plus equity, right? And that's where you're sort of like, are you really part of this mission or not? But I would say the right individuals, to Anand's point, they are very happy to take very low cash to no cash sometimes, and really sort of put their time in, sometimes defer comp, which is something that not a lot of founders and C-suite think of, right? There is this concept of deferred compensation.
Right.
And you can talk to KOLs or advisory board members and say, listen, we're about 6 months, a year away from one of our milestone raise. When we raise that, we'll have some element of cash as an incentive there. But oftentimes I see advisors come in first with equity and then some form of cash comp arrangement as a part of the milestones. Very importantly, that's aligned to the company's trajectory. And that's those, I always suggest to founders, that's the right type of individual that you want, because not only from a passion and vision, but they're also aligned incentive-wise with the journey of the company.
That's a great point. And AJ, from your experience, does having an impressive scientific advisory board affect valuation for early stage companies? That's I have to say, many of these questions come from our participating cohort companies, but that's something that comes up. If I get a few more KOLs in on my advisory board, is that going to be viewed favorably in the eyes of prospective investors?
Frederick, I have a knack for provocative questions. You're setting me up pretty well. Look, I use the analogy of being a listed company, right? If you see valuation as a sugar spike, sure. Have a number of very famous advisors on there and you'll get a nice sugar spike, right?
Right.
But if you don't deliver afterwards with
of course
product, results, whatever, you'll have a sugar crash. So yes, I unfortunately, from the pre-Theranos days all the way down, I think, and that's why I stress the symbolism aspect, is it's a very dangerous sort of practice to get attractive individuals on boards and scientific advisory boards, but having the right people and not worrying, and I know this is the provocative section, valuation shouldn't be your driver, right? It really should be sustainability. I mean, valuation will come with the right measures, but if that's your North Star, everything else will sort of follow in practice.
Yeah. Great advice. I appreciate that. Anand, I just wanted to talk to you very briefly about the legal board of directors, not the scientific advisory board, but the legal board of directors. How's that evolved at Remedio, and do the additional board members typically come in as you get additional investors come in? I know, for example, you had major generics player in India, Sun Pharma, took a sizable stake. I think it was close to 1/3 of Remedios last year. How did that affect your board composition? How did that affect your recruitment and organizational strategy?
Okay. I think to answer your first question, which is obviously the legal board of directors, as you'll have more investor nominee directors that join in on the board. But I think I wanted to sort of pause there and talk about some things which I personally feel I didn't do well early, which is especially a lot of us who are technology or product-driven founders, I believe that bringing in early business advisory boards are actually pretty good because of the fact that they enable you to see whether or not you are able to scale or not with what you have as an idea. And I believe that the number of pivots you do with products or with services or with segments reduce if you have someone who's able to sort of come in with a little bit of a bigger picture insight from market downwards. And therefore, I feel that these sometimes may not be your nominee investor directors, but would be those besides them, right? And they also are not your scientific advisory board members, but are those who've been in this business and sort of know what works, what does not work. So I feel that I was a little late in terms of bringing those folks in, and I feel it's extremely important to bring some of them in early. That's point number one I wanted to make. Second, to your question in terms of, we sort of treaded a journey where we were trying to bring technology to primary care, right? So we were also trying to cause behavior change.
Yep.
And I believe that behavior change cannot be done unless and otherwise you have other members in the ecosystem together. And that's really where I talk about, if you look at the entire consumer or the patient journey, it starts all the way from detection of disease to what we like to call connected care, where you go all the way to the treatment side. And in places like India, where preventive health is not significantly incentivized, it's important, therefore, to align with other ecosystem players, which is what we did in terms of being able to have that investment coming in from Sun Pharma, which incidentally also happened as a result of a key publication that we put out in literature, and led to a doctor who was on their board recommending. And so it was an inbound, rather than an outbound from us. It was an inbound that happened there.
Okay.
But what have been the changes? I think we understand better where the product or service fits in the larger scheme of the patient journey. And we are able to take advantage of some of what you can do now as a result of being able to have a partner that's able to close the care gap loop.
Right.
And that's extremely important in the business that we are in, because we are doing the discovery of finding those that are in need, but you need a way by which you move them to a care gap closure. And that's one significant change that we have had from a narrative perspective of now actually going beyond just discovery, but going up to the care gap closure. The second key change from a narrative perspective is it's helped us broaden our canvas, right? Because now, at the end of the day, you need to realize that while we may have roughly around close to around 40 to 50 people on the field, in pharma, that's a much larger number. That's point number one. But what we were very clear on, and to be very honest, in this case, Sun Pharma was also very clear on, is our intent was to actually build out a team within their group that was going to work with us, rather than thinking in terms of a traditional medical rep or a traditional pharmaceutical executives looking at medical device sales. So therefore, it's a co-creation model. And so in the co-creation model, you're going back to being a startup, right? Except in this case, now you're co-creating that model with someone who's an ecosystem player.
Right.
So that's how things have changed. It's changed, of course, on one side. Of course, one way to look at it is the narratives are therefore gotten bigger, and therefore you will attract a lot more talent that wants to look at the bigger canvas. But I think it's the other way around also for us, where we are starting to ask the question, how do you now, because it's for the first time that you're looking at a combination of pharma plus device in a nascent ecosystem. So you need to get it right. And you need to make sure that you do it right, and you do it the right way. And these are certain things that are extremely important. And therefore, a lot of what we do, for me personally, it comes first around values, right? And therefore, we start from values to teams to then how we get things to market. So therefore, from a recruitment perspective, it's us coming back to as a startup and saying, how do we now work with an ecosystem player to create those teams there? And for us, therefore, on the research and development side, it gives Philip to now do more R&D on more products, because now you have someone who's working with you on the GTM, at least in being able to do that in India, and participate in the process of behavior change, right? And that's extremely important, especially when your product or service is on the preventive health side. So those would be the changes. But if I were to summarize that, business advisory board member, I think that's something that I feel I did it late, and it's important to think about it early.
Great point.
Second, ecosystem. Always by yourself, you can do something, but with an ecosystem, you can do a lot more. And therefore, it's important to look at how you can form those partnerships. And the third part is it's actually going back to being a startup. And that's the part I love. Even as you know, from a research and development, there are more products that you can now bring to market through a very unique GTM.
Yeah. Great advice, Anand. Thanks for that. I wanted to spend the remainder of our time on scaling businesses, and I'll come back to you, Anand, in a moment, and commercialization. But let me turn to AJ first. We know typically that after a significant fundraise, company maybe raises $10 million, $20 million. There are usually immediate expectations from the investors to scale and to maybe expand the team at multiple levels very quickly. What's your experience at that stage of the evolution of a company? What are some of the challenges? Is there now all of a sudden a whole different set of leadership skills that are required of the CEO? And is that sometimes where you see perhaps changes at that level? Share with us a little bit about your experience there, AJ.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. So, look, I sort of see the innovation journey of emerging companies to be, your initial stage is your idea to product, right? Your MVP, your product sort of situation. So that's your stage one, and then you've got your product to pre-commercial. So basically, that's your validation stage, which is clinical trials, and basically you're getting to that regulatory bridge. And then really, what we're talking about is stage three, which is you've got, perhaps you're in a home market, you've got regulatory in a few different markets, and now you've got that pure scale strategy. Now, I probably passionately want to see founding CEOs to stay and be part of their journey, but often as a recruitment partner, this is where we do get brought in quite often because it's just a natural evolution of things where as a company gets to that stage, smart founders actually realize sometimes that they don't have that skill. And the over passionate founders need to be sort of coaxed by a combination of board members and individuals like us that, this is what the company, the precipice of where the company's at, and this is where you're looking to go. But yes, I do believe less of a funding concept, more of a journey position, where they're at that stage of multiplying. They've formed some sort of home field advantage. Now they're really looking for expansion. And as a function of that, now they've raised funds and acquired those funds. They're looking to build those teams. And this is really where there seems to be a change in skill sets at the top level. And oftentimes we get brought in as part of a change management function, which is great, because we work with the current CEO, work through the new org structure, and then sort of build the new people in. I think that's the best way to do it. The other side of that is where the investors go, okay, now we're ready for a new CEO. We've had the talk with the current CEO. Can you facilitate this new identification? And and oftentimes here is where we either bring people with strong serial commercial CEO experience, or on rare instances, we will bring in top-level corporate C-level individuals who are now able to take a younger company and scale. For example, in surgical robotics, which is where the Mullings Group has been for the last 15, 17 years, we've really carved a niche here. oftentimes we'll work with the large strategics to bring in new CEOs at this point of scale because they've got that multi-global,
Right.
multi-P&L experience. So I hope that answers your question,
Yeah,
Frederick.
no, absolutely. And it also brings up the question about whether or not someone with that multinational, large strategic background and career background can adjust to fit into a startup environment and take on that sort of a role. Because there are some risks getting, I would imagine, getting someone in who's been with a very large corporate their entire lives and having the backing of an organization of 50 to 100,000 people in different specialties, and now all of a sudden he's in a team of 12 and or she. What are your thoughts on that, AJ? Is that something that you see as being problematic sometimes, or is that not really an issue too?
No, I mean, I think, look, it's all part of back to what Anand and I have talked about around fit, drive, governance. But I always advise board members and founding or C-suite teams, don't just look at it from a black and white sort of concept of this person's, coming from a huge company and they obviously can't do a startup. I mean, that's just, too much of a fit in a box sort of mindset.
Right.
The best headhunting or HR partners, our job is to really identify this individual's passion.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I mean, I was the same individual, 22 years in corporate, and I was ready to work in startup. And and everybody sort of needs that opportunity to kind of demonstrate that passion, right? So yes, I would say a cookie cutter approach isn't the greatest. But really, like you would, with hiring anybody, put them through that pressure test and really vet their passion and their drive. I've seen some corporate, C-level or VPs come into startups as C-level individuals and just do tremendous jobs because they've really zoned in on what they want to do for the next 15, 20 years of their career. And sometimes they are serial CEOs with fantastic exit experiences. So yeah, I think it's all part of that real fit finding process.
Right. That's a great point. Thanks, AJ. Anand, I wanted to ask you about your the scaling of Remedio beyond your domestic border. So you have a team now in Singapore, you have a growing team in the US. How did you get to that point? How did you go about building those organizations, and what were some of the challenges along the way?
So 2 to 3 key things, right? First up, an acknowledgement that hits you very hard that just because you know how to sell in India doesn't mean you know how to sell in the US. It's extremely important to acknowledge and know that, right? So in my personal case, I spent a couple of years going around in the US trying to get the product market fit, seeing where exactly we had a fit. And this is where I make the point on the business advisory board, or even what AJ said about having, if you have the right person, then the zoning in, I think, is extremely important, right? Now, if you think in terms of, if the vision is to be able to serve an existing segment in a market, I think the zoning in approach is the way to go, because someone who's been there, done that, and knows how to do that. If you're creating a market, then you need slightly different sets of people. So in the US as well, it's the same framework, right? I wasn't sure in terms of what the long-term story was going to be, right? And therefore, for me, it was very important that I don't look at someone who's looking at it for the short term, because it's not going to work out, right? And you are going to have pivots, you're going to have learnings, you're going to make changes. So the very first hire was, again, someone who related to the purpose behind how we do. And most importantly, our current chief commercial officer, who's been with us for 6 years in the US, purpose is what brought him in. And what was very important for him was how we do something. For him, the how was important. The why he understood, but he liked the how in us, right? And so that resulted in that ability to form that first person in out. Second, we had to wait for at least 2 to 3 years because we needed to see. I mean, now, of course, we've crossed 1,000 devices in the US, but we just had a 2 to 3 person team, right? And the reason is because we had to see how scalable is this, right? Are your narratives that help you scale in a context like a developing world like India necessarily hold their own? We had to sort of make sure that the product had the chassis the same, but had embellishments as well as the covers that are going to be more driven by the product market fit need there. So again, what we did was we took someone, as I said earlier, who had a strong product management and marketing background, who sort of knows the kinds of things that need to be done to get the fit right. And by the way, can also then drive that early business development, which is how we ended up doing that there, right? And now that we've had a certain amount of acceptance, etc., we then started doing the experiments in the year. So the first set of folks that we looked at, and that's the reason why once India was stabilized, I had to work with the team there to be able to do these experiments, right? And the reason to do the experiments is you don't want to bring in the team very early before knowing whether what got you to from 0 to 1,000 is also going to work for 1,000 to 10,000. Because I always feel that talent is contextual. You can get the right person at the wrong time in the company.
Right.
You can also bring the wrong person at the right time in the company. So
good point.
Those are things which you have to do only on the basis of thought experiments that you do. And this is where, at least right now, having some of these business advisory board members has really helped in sort of, as founders, you tend to be super passionate on the execution side, super passionate on the operational side. But I think where it really helps, either you bring in the talent or if it's the C-suite members themselves, there's a time where the transition has to happen significantly on the strategic, right? And it's something that I had to embrace. I had to learn to unlearn and then embrace, right? And the unlearning is a very critical part. It's not easy, but you have to, otherwise you would not. And so in the US as well, therefore, we started first with finding someone with purpose, then someone who's looking at this long term, and then working with us through failures.
Right.
First, right? Until you get the first success and then the first scale. And then it's about the small experiments to ask, can you get from 1,000 to 10,000? At which point, I think you bring in the commercial team, at which point, to be very honest, I'll have to take a sidestep completely because in a framework-driven market like the US, there's no way I can sort of be the one leading that change there. And that is something that I'm at least very clear on. It has to be someone that comes in who knows how to effect that change of scale effectively there. And that's something that all of us, I'm personally looking forward to because of the fact that then brings in a very different level of scale for the organization in the US, and who those ecosystem partners are, etc. will be very different from ecosystem partners that we found in India. So I think that's how I look at it. It's someone you're adding people to the journey who then scale the journey.
Makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. We are a little bit over time, so we'll have to wrap up. I did want to turn to each of you, and I'll turn to AJ first for any sort of final words of advice to our cohort companies as you reflect on the conversations that we had this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. Look, first of all, phenomenal opportunity. I think, Anand, I've learned so much about just your success story and really the elements that have made Remedio successful as well. I just want to echo some of the things that both Anand and I have said. Young companies, it's really about the passion, the mission. Don't always get I know it's a hallmark greeting card statement that I'm about to make, but don't always just discourage about funding. I mean, everybody talks about this market is harder than the last year, and this funding this year is harder than the last year. But really, it's about do the best in terms of solving a problem, do the best in terms of the solution, the quality. Put a lot of work into the passion and the culture you're trying to build into that first amalgamated founding team and build from there. And what I loved about what Anand said, and I've experienced this as well, also be humble and a student of the art to know that what may have worked in one market doesn't work in another market, right? Don't force fit what's worked in the, I've seen, and I've worked with a lot of clients in the US that go, this is how we do it in the US, this is how we're going to do it in Singapore. And that's just not a recipe for success, right? So the agility to be able to learn, problem solve, take the hits, and then readapt And the last element, I'm shamelessly stealing from Anand, but I love the fact that he said going back to thinking like a startup. To me, that was really, really powerful because I've seen the companies are able to kind of, subtract the hubris and go back to what did we do back when we started? How do we think? How do we act? That really helps to kind of do a little sanity check, right? So those are some of the things that I guess it's more about what I got out of this session rather than a summary of what I believe in.
Yeah, that's helpful, AJ. Thanks for that. And Anand, any sort of closing words, tips, and advice to our cohort company before we part ways with them?
People's a very important part and if anything at all, we talked about valuation. I feel that product is great. People are the ones that are going to drive valuation as much. And that's why I think it's important to look at the people aspect of a business very early. And that is the one part that I would look at. And that's where I would also say some of what folks like AJ who've been in the business for long, right? Where they've seen things. It's extremely important to sort of, and I oftentimes feel that people think when you have the funding, then you can go talk to people, but rather it's the other way around. You got to talk early to sort of understand what's needed when. So in addition to some of what AJ talked about, one key point I would want to make is never stop recruiting, right? Always be on the lookout. Because I really think it's people that actually make companies and it's people that help scale companies. And oftentimes you need to keep looking for the next set and not get very comfortable about where you are as an organization. And that's where I think if you combine people with the ability of those people to problem solve, I believe scale as well as impact and everything else happens. People and problem solving are the two P's. We focus a lot on the product and the service as well as the markets. But I think these two P's are very important, the people and the problem solving part.
Excellent, excellent advice. Thank you both, gentlemen, so much for joining our discussion this morning. This has been terrific. Some great comments, terrific insights, and some really good advice to our cohort companies. Don't go away. We're going into closed door Q&A in just a moment, but we will say thank you to our audience on YouTube and LinkedIn. And join us again on the 12th of September, which is when we'll be hosting our next webinar.